I said it the way you say things you don't mean. The way you say we should do this more often when you're already halfway out the door. The way you say call me anytime to someone whose number you've never once dialed. Throwaway words. The kind that dissolve in the air the second they leave your mouth. I was standing in the break room on the 32nd floor. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays smell like someone's lunch reheated one too many days in a row. And that particular Tuesday smelled like exactly that. I had my coffee in both hands. I was cold. The air conditioning in that building ran like it was trying to punish us. Joan was standing by the window. She always stood by the window when she came down to our floor, which wasn't often. She was the CEO. She had a whole floor of her own above us, a glass office that caught the afternoon light and made her look like something out of a magazine that knew better than to call itself a business magazine. But that Tuesday, she was there, in the break room, pouring the free coffee that no one drank because it tasted like burnt paper. And I walked in, and she turned and said, "You look terrible, Lucy." And I laughed. Because I did. I hadn't slept. I had a presentation in 4 hours, and a blouse with a coffee stain on the inside of the cuff that I was hoping no one would notice. And my hair was doing something that I had given up trying to understand. "I feel like I'm getting married tomorrow," I said. "All the nerves, none of the party." She smiled. Not the smile she gave during board meetings. The one that was controlled and precise, and meant exactly as much as it intended to mean. This one was smaller, more accidental. "You should find someone worth that kind of nervous," she said. And I don't know why. I don't know what part of my brain short-circuited in that exact moment. But what came out of my mouth was, "We should get married someday." I said it to her. To Joan, my CEO. I said it the way you say things you don't mean. And she looked at me for a second. Just 1 second, the kind that takes longer than a second, and said, "How about Saturday?" Then she picked up her coffee and walked out. And I stood there in the break room on the 32nd floor on a Tuesday that smelled like reheated leftovers, and I thought, that was nothing. That was a joke. That was exactly the kind of thing people say. I thought that for 6 days straight. I thought it so hard it almost worked. Here's what I knew about Joan before that Tuesday. She had been the CEO of Hartwell & Dre for 3 years. She had taken over from the founder's daughter after a restructuring that people in our office still talked about in the specific, reverent tone that people use when they're not sure if they survived something or just got lucky. She wore her dark hair pulled back almost every day except Fridays, when she left it down in a way that made her look like a different person. Or maybe like the person she actually was, and everything else was the costume. She didn't eat lunch at her desk. She went somewhere, no one knew where. She had a laugh that you heard before you understood what was funny. And she made me nervous. Not in the way a boss makes you nervous when you're afraid of her. In the way a room makes you nervous when you walk into it, and everything in it is exactly right, and you're suddenly aware of your own elbows. I had worked at Hartwell & Dre for 2 years. I was in client relations, which sounds like it should be something elegant, and is mostly managing expectations and convincing people that what they're getting is what they asked for. I was good at it. I was organized in a way that other people sometimes mistook for calm. I had systems, labeled folders, both digital and physical. A color-coded calendar that my roommate Priya once photographed and sent to her sister as an example of either extreme competence or early signs of a personality disorder, depending on the week. My life made sense. That's the honest version. It made sense the way things make sense when you've worked hard enough and long enough to arrange everything into a shape that holds. I had a lease I could afford, a routine I liked, a friend group small enough to keep, and large enough to feel like enough. I had been in one relationship in the previous 3 years, with a woman named Cass, who I had met at a ceramics class. I joined mostly out of desperation during a particularly boring winter, and who had been warm and funny and entirely wrong for me in a way that took both of us 18 months to say out loud. What I mean is, My life was structured, and I knew how to live inside a structure. What I did not know was what to do with something that didn't fit the shape. Joan didn't fit any shape I had. I don't mean that in a romantic way. I mean it in the exact literal way that some people don't map onto any category you have for them. She wasn't warm in the way people mean when they say warm. She wasn't cold either. She was direct. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers, which sounds like something everyone does until you spend enough time around people who don't. She had opinions and stated them plainly without the performance of certainty that some people use to cover the fact that they're not actually certain of anything. I had spoken to her maybe a dozen times before that Tuesday. Most of those conversations were professional. Presentations, corridors, the brief moment at the company's anniversary dinner, where I ended up next to her at the bar, because the line for the bathroom was long, and I came back to find her there, and neither of us moved for about 15 minutes, talking about nothing and everything in the way you do when the social contract has temporarily loosened. I remembered that evening more than I had admitted to myself. She had asked me what I actually liked about my work, not in the interview sense, in the real sense. And I had told her about the moment a client calls you not to complain, but just to say thank you, it worked, and how that particular phone call never got old. And she had looked at me and said, "That's the part people don't write in the job description." And I had thought, yes, exactly. And then immediately thought about something else, because she was looking at me in a way that didn't quite land on anything I had a name for. After the break room that Tuesday, I thought about it again. And then I thought about what I'd said. We should get married someday. And what she had said back. And I told myself, it was a joke. We were both joking. That's what it was. I told myself that for 6 days. The presentation went fine. Better than fine, actually. The client shook my hand twice and said I was exactly the kind of person they wanted on their account going forward. And my manager Diane gave me the look she gives when she's about to say something nice but doesn't want to oversell it. It should have been the best day of my week. Instead, I spent most of it thinking about a coffee break that lasted 4 minutes. I noticed it first as a distraction. The ordinary kind. The way a song gets stuck in your head not because it's your favorite, but because it was playing at the exact wrong moment, and now it lives in you against your will. I'd be in the middle of an email and I'd catch myself replaying the way she said, "How about Saturday?" The tone of it, light and dry. The half smile that came with it. And whether she had paused before she said it, or if I was only now inventing the pause. I wasn't worried. Not yet. I was annoyed with myself, which is different. By Thursday, I'd stopped letting myself replay it and started focusing on the obvious explanation. Joan was witty. It was a well-known fact about her. People in the office collected her remarks the way people collect things that are good, without quite understanding why they're good. The remark in the break room had been a version of that. Nothing more. I was fine. And then Friday came. And she left her hair down, and I was in the elevator when she walked in. And she said, "How's the Castellano account?" because she remembered that I'd been working on it. And I said closed, actually. Ahead of schedule. And she looked genuinely pleased and said, "That's yours, Lucy. That's all you." And something in my chest did something I could not categorize. Not a flutter. Nothing so simple. More like a gear that was already turning, having to turn slightly differently to accommodate a new part that had been placed in the mechanism without my consent. I got off on my floor and stood in front of my desk for a moment longer than necessary. That's nothing, I thought. That's my boss being professional. That's a person being decent. That's normal. I sat down and opened my laptop and started reviewing my notes for Monday. But the thing about a gear is that once it moves, it moves. You don't get to put it back by deciding it shouldn't have moved. The weekend was supposed to help. Priya and I went to the farmer's market on Saturday, and she talked about her sister's wedding, and I bought too many stone fruits, and we sat outside a coffee shop for 2 hours, and I felt almost entirely normal. Almost. Sunday, I cleaned my apartment, which I do when I need to feel like things are orderly. I labeled 2 new folders. I rearranged my bookshelf by color, then decided that was ridiculous, then put it back by author. I thought about Saturday. The word Saturday. How about Saturday? I thought, she was being funny. She was playing with the absurdity of it. It was the kind of humor that's only as pointed as you let it be, and I was not going to let it be pointed at all. I thought, I'm a person with a color-coded calendar and labeled folders, and I am not the kind of person who reads into a joke set at 7:45 in the morning in a break room that smells like reheated lunch. I thought these things with complete conviction. And then Monday morning, I was in the elevator again, and she wasn't there. And I noticed she wasn't there, and I immediately noticed that I'd noticed, and my stomach did something small and quiet and completely uninvited. No, I thought. Just that. No. It didn't help. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not deliberately. It wasn't surveillance. It wasn't anything with intention behind it. But suddenly I was aware of her footsteps in the hallway. The particular sound of her voice when she was in a meeting behind a closed door, which carried a different register than her regular voice. Lower, slower, more careful. The way she held her phone when she was reading something that mattered versus something that didn't. The fact that she always took the stairs when she was going only 1 floor up, and the elevator when she was going more than 2. And I had never noticed this before, and now I knew it without having tried. This is the thing about paying attention. Once you start, you can't make yourself stop. And the more you notice, the more you understand you've been not noticing for longer than you realized. There was a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the break room, after the elevator, after Sunday's bookshelf rearrangement, when she came to our floor for a department meeting that ran over by 40 minutes, and afterward she poured herself the bad coffee again and leaned against the counter and said to no one in particular, I really should bring better coffee from upstairs. And I said, You could. No one's stopping you. And she looked at me and smiled and said, You always say exactly what I'm thinking. I went back to my desk. I sat down. I opened a spreadsheet. I thought, this is a problem. Not because of what she said, because of what I felt when she said it. The particular kind of warmth, specific, located, impossible to misattribute, that started in the center of my chest and radiated outward in a way I recognized. I recognized it because I'd felt it before, a long time ago. With Cass, at the beginning, before the beginning, in the weeks when I still thought I could explain it as friendship. I knew what this was. I sat very still at my desk, looking at the spreadsheet without seeing it, and I thought, no, not this, not her. But the problem with knowing your own feelings is that once you've named them to yourself, you can't unname them. And I had named this one. Right there, at my desk, at 3:15 on a Wednesday afternoon. I closed the spreadsheet. I opened it again. I stared at it for the rest of the afternoon and pretended I was working. There is a kind of avoidance that looks exactly like professionalism. I want to be precise about this, because I was very good at it. I answered every email promptly. I prepared meeting materials in advance. I smiled in the elevator and asked the right questions in the right rooms, and did my job with the kind of focused competence that, from the outside, looked like I had never been more present in my entire career. From the inside, I was managing proximity. Joan had a pattern. I knew it now without meaning to know it. Department reviews, 3rd Tuesday of the month. Annual planning meetings, last Friday of each quarter. Break room, roughly 3 times a week, always around 7:30 or 8, before most of the floor arrived. I knew her schedule not because I had studied it, but because knowing it had become the kind of automatic, quiet activity that happens below the level of decision. I started coming in at 8:15. It wasn't obvious. No one noticed. Diane noticed, once, and said, "You're getting in later," and I said, "Traffic," and she nodded, and that was that. I told myself I needed to reset. That this was a temporary recalibration, a practical decision made by a practical person to avoid a situation that had no practical resolution. She was my CEO. She was 12 years older than me and occupied a different planet within the same building, a planet made of board reports and investor calls and decisions that affected hundreds of people. And I was a person who bought too many stone fruits at farmers' markets and rearranged her bookshelf when she was anxious. I said this to myself clearly and logically, and it made complete sense. And then one Thursday, she came down to our floor, not at 7:30, but at 10, which was outside the pattern, and I nearly walked directly into her in the corridor because I wasn't expecting her, and I had been moving quickly with a folder of printed materials under my arm, and she was coming around the corner, and we stopped about 8 inches apart. I felt the air change. Not in any poetic sense. I felt the physical reality of being very close to someone, the warmth of another person, the breath width of space between us. And I felt my own body register it in a way that had no ambiguity. She said, "Lucy," just my name. The way she said it, that pause before like she'd come around the corner and found exactly what she was expecting to find, undid about 3 weeks of very deliberate 8:15 arrivals. "Joan," I said, very steady. I was proud of how steady. "I was looking for you, actually." She nodded at my folder. "The Brennan proposal. I heard you're heading that up." "I am. I'd like to be briefed directly, if that works for you. We've got history with this account at the executive level, and I want to make sure the approach is aligned." She said this the way she said everything in professional contexts, clear, unhurried, completely reasonable. "My assistant will set something up." "Of course," I said. She nodded, started to move past me, then paused, just slightly, so briefly I almost believed I imagined it, and said, without quite looking at me, "I owe you a better coffee than the stuff downstairs." And she kept walking. I stood in the corridor with my folder and thought about whether to understand that as anything at all. I understood it as nothing. That was the professional thing to do. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 45 minutes in her office, which I had been in exactly once before, briefly, for a company all hands that had involved champagne and no direct conversation with her. This time it was just the two of us, and a glass table, and the afternoon light coming through the windows at the angle that made her look like that. She had brought good coffee. 2 cups on the table already poured, which meant she had prepared for this meeting the way she prepared for things, quietly, in advance, without making a show of it. I sat down. She sat across from me. She opened the proposal brief I'd sent and asked a precise, intelligent question about the account history. And I answered it. And she asked another. And I answered that one too. And somewhere in the middle of this I realized I had forgotten to be nervous. Not because I was calm, but because talking to her was easy in a way that had no business being easy between a CEO and a client relations associate who had accidentally said something ridiculous in the break room a month ago. She listened the way very few people listen. Not passively, actively, leaning forward slightly, tracking the logic of what I was saying, and then asking the follow-up that proved she had actually followed it. She challenged 2 of my assumptions, and was right about both of them, and instead of feeling defensive, I felt something closer to grateful, which was strange and completely true. At some point she said, "You think in systems," and I said, "I've been told it's either a gift or a warning sign," and she laughed. The real laugh, the one you heard before you understood the joke. And I thought, don't. Do not feel what you are feeling right now. I felt it anyway. 45 minutes became 90. Her assistant knocked once. She said, "Give me 10 more," and the 10 became 20. When I finally left her office with the amended proposal brief and a handshake that lasted half a second longer than necessary, I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there trying to determine whether the warmth in my hands was from the coffee cup or from something else entirely. It was the coffee cup. I was very certain about this. I called Priya that night. I did not tell her what I was actually calling about. I said the Brennan account was going well. I said work was busy. Priya, who has known me for 7 years, and who could always tell the difference between me talking and me talking about something else, said, "What's actually happening?" "Nothing," I said. Pause. "Lucy?" "I'm fine." Another pause, the kind that meant she was deciding whether to push. "Are you sleeping?" she asked instead. "Fine," I said. "Is this about someone?" "Priya, because you have the voice." "I don't have a voice. You absolutely have a voice. It's the voice where you say everything is fine in the exact tone that means something is happening that you have not yet given yourself permission to think about." I was quiet. "It's nobody," I said. "It's nothing. It's work." "Okay," she said, in the tone that meant she knew exactly what nothing meant, and had decided to let me arrive at the truth on my own schedule. I hung up and sat on my couch in the dark for a while. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when you're trying very hard not to think a specific thought. It has a texture. It fills the room like something physical. I sat inside that silence and looked at the wall and tried to think about the Brennan proposal, and thought instead about 90 minutes at a glass table with afternoon light and a cup of good coffee, and the way she'd said "you think" in systems like it was a thing she'd already decided about me. I thought about Saturday. I thought about all the Saturdays I hadn't thought about on purpose. I thought, this is fine. This is manageable. Nothing has happened. And nothing had. That was the truest part of it. Nothing had happened, which was exactly what made it so difficult. When things happen, you can point to them. You can hold them up and examine them and decide what they are. But this was all in the margins. The pause before my name, the second coffee cup, the 10 minutes that became 20. These were not events. These were the spaces between events. And the spaces between things are the hardest places to dismiss, because they're too quiet to argue with. I started writing in a notebook I kept in my nightstand. Not about her, or not directly. I wrote about the Brennan account. I wrote grocery lists. I wrote down words I liked the sound of. I wrote, "I am a practical person with a color-coded calendar, and none of this is going anywhere." I read it back and thought, that's the saddest sentence I've ever written. I closed the notebook. I lay in the dark, and in the quiet of my own chest, where no one could argue with me, I admitted the truth I had been spending so many careful weeks avoiding. I was in trouble. Not the practical kind, not the professional kind, the other kind, the kind that can't be organized into labeled folders or solved by arriving 15 minutes later, or managed by spending a Sunday afternoon rearranging a bookshelf. The kind that has a name, and I knew the name and I was not ready to say it out loud. Not yet. Not to Priya. Not to anyone. Not even to myself. Not fully. Not in the way that makes it real. But in the middle of that specific Tuesday night, with the lights off and the city quiet outside my window, with a notebook full of grocery lists and the memory of a laugh I'd heard before I understood the joke, I was closer to saying it than I'd ever been. But before we go any further, if you've made it this far, you already know this feeling. The one you can't name until it's too late to pretend you didn't feel it. If this story is doing something to you right now, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel more than you know. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on the bell. That way, YouTube will let you know the moment the next story goes up. Now I want to know something from you in the comments. Have you ever tried to avoid someone and realized the avoiding was making it worse? Tell me about it. I read every single comment. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'll drop a heart. Now, let's go back to Lucy. The Brennan account closed in early April. There was a dinner, the kind of client dinner that gets planned by committee and is technically celebratory and practically exhausting. I wore a dress I hadn't worn since a friend's gallery opening 18 months ago. Diane gave a toast. The client gave a toast. There was too much bread and not enough water, and at some point I ended up at the far end of the table from where I was supposed to be, and Joan was 2 seats down. She had the right kind of earrings for that room. Small, gold, simple. The kind that looked like they'd been chosen without effort, which is always the hardest thing to pull off. She was in a conversation with someone from the client's board, and I watched her the way I watched her when I thought I wasn't being obvious about it, which is to say, not carefully enough. She caught me. Not dramatically. Not in the movie sense. She didn't hold my gaze across a crowded room. She just looked over, between sentences, and I was looking at her, and there was a beat of acknowledgement. Not I caught you. More like, yes, I know. I looked away. I finished my wine. Outside, afterward, waiting for a car that was taking longer than it should, I ended up on the sidewalk with 3 people from accounting and Joan, who had come outside because, she said, she needed the air. The accounting team got their car first. Then it was just us. This was not part of my strategy. My strategy had involved leaving early and pretending I had an early morning. It was 51 degrees and I was underdressed, and she said, "You should have brought a jacket." "I know," I said. "You always dress for where you want to be, not where you are." I didn't know what to do with that. I looked at her. "Is that an observation or a criticism?" "An observation," she said. "I do it too. It's not entirely a flaw." We stood there for a moment. The street was quiet in the specific way that streets get quiet after 10 on a weeknight, when the city hasn't gone to sleep but it's stopped performing. Somewhere behind us, a restaurant was closing. A woman was stacking chairs. "Lucy," she said. Something about the way she said my name at this particular moment, not the corridor version, not the professional version, made me very still. "Yes." She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I counted it. Long enough that I had time to understand I was holding my breath and to decide not to fix it. "I think I should tell you something," she said. "Okay," I said. She was quiet for another moment. Not the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say. The silence of someone who is deciding how to say what they already know. "I've been thinking about the break room," she said. "What you said. My heart did something geological. Not fast. More like a slow shift. Tectonic." "I was joking," I said. "Very steady." Again, I was proud of how steady. "I know," she said. Pause. "Were you?" I don't think I breathed for 6 seconds. I know because I counted those too. Here is the thing about a question like that. It's not actually a question about the past. It's a question about the present. It's a question about what you're willing to say out loud in the cold on a Tuesday night, on a sidewalk outside a restaurant, while someone who has been rearranging the inside of your chest for 4 months waits for your answer. I thought about my notebook, the grocery lists. I am a practical person with a color-coded calendar. I thought about all the 8:15 arrivals, and all the careful routes through the building, and all the Sundays I had spent rearranging a bookshelf so I wouldn't think about this exact moment. I thought, this is the moment. This is the one I've been either preparing for or running from, and I can't tell the difference anymore. "Joan," I said. "Yes. I don't know how to answer that." She nodded slowly, like that was an answer. Like she'd been expecting that specific non-answer. "I know," she said again. And then she said something that I hadn't expected. Not a confession, not a declaration. Something much quieter and much harder to recover from. "You don't have to. Not tonight. My car arrived." We both looked at it. "Go home," she said. "Sleep. Joan, we have the Brennan debrief on Thursday," she said. Her voice had returned to the other register, the one that was careful and professional and exact. "I'll see you then." I got in the car. I watched her on the sidewalk as we pulled away, standing there in the right earrings and the coat she'd brought, even though she didn't need me to know she'd planned for the cold. And I thought, for the first time without argument, without a list, without a color-coded system, I am in love with her. Just like that. The way you say things that are true. No qualifier, no footnote. No, this is probably nothing attached to the end of it. I was in love with Joan. I sat in the back of the car and looked out the window at the city going by, and I thought about all the things I was now going to have to figure out what to do with. I didn't know, but I also, for the first time in 4 months, didn't try to pretend I didn't know what the feeling was. That was something. That was actually a lot. Thursday came. The Brennan debrief was professional. It was exactly 40 minutes. We sat at the glass table and talked about account metrics and relationship management strategy, and I took notes, and she made 2 observations I hadn't thought of, and I made 1 she hadn't thought of, and she wrote it down, which she didn't need to do but did anyway. When it was over, she said, "Good work on this one, Lucy." I said, "Thank you." Neither of us mentioned the sidewalk. Neither of us mentioned my name said in the dark outside a restaurant, or the question that didn't quite get answered, or the thing I had finally said to myself in the back of a car while the city moved past the window. And that should have felt like an ending. It felt like the opposite. It felt like standing at the edge of something that hadn't declared its shape yet. Priya, that weekend. You're different. Me. I'm not. Priya. Looking at me across the coffee shop table. You look like someone who made a decision. Me. I haven't made any decision. Her, very carefully, or like someone who's waiting to. I looked at my coffee. I thought about whether to say anything, about how much to say, about what it would mean to say it out loud to another person and not just to the back of a car on a Tuesday night. "There's someone," I said. Priya waited. "It's complicated," I said. "The situation is, there's a lot between us that I don't know how to navigate. I stopped. "It's not simple. Love isn't usually," Priya said, "not dramatically, just as a fact." I looked at her. I didn't say love. She just looked at me. "Okay," I said. "Fine. I know what I feel. I know. But knowing isn't the same as..." I gestured vaguely at the space between the feeling and the doing anything about it. "She's in a position where anything between us is complicated, and I don't know if she asked me something. Last Tuesday. And I didn't answer." "Why didn't you answer?" I sat with that for a second. "Because I wasn't ready," I said. I'd been so focused on not feeling it that I hadn't figured out what to do with feeling it. And now I know what I feel. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. But I don't know what she's decided about any of it. And we're in a situation where I can't just walk into her office and say, "You know." Priya nodded slowly. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." "Lucy." She said my name in a way that was very specifically Priya, the version of my name that meant you already know the answer. You're just scared of it. You've been organizing your whole life to keep this at a distance, and it's still here. I didn't say anything. "You color-coded your feelings," she said, "and they didn't stay in their folders." I laughed. I couldn't help it. She didn't laugh. She just watched me with the kind of affection that is also patience. "You have time," she said. "It doesn't have to be today. I know. But you should stop pretending you don't know what you want." I looked at my coffee. The city outside, the ordinary Saturday morning going on around us like nothing significant was happening anywhere in the world. "I want her," I said. The first time I'd said it out loud. The first time the sentence existed anywhere outside my own head. Priya nodded. "I know," she said. "That's why you called me 4 weeks ago and said it was nothing." The following Monday, I came in at 7:30. Not with a plan, not with a speech, Not with anything labeled or color-coded or organized into a system. Just 7:30. In the break room, with the bad coffee and the reheated leftovers smell that would start up in a few hours when the rest of the floor arrived. I stood by the window. She came in at 7:34. She saw me and stopped. A pause so brief it was almost not a pause at all. Then she walked to the coffee, poured a cup, and turned around. We looked at each other across the break room. She said, "You're in early." "I know," I said. A beat. "I've been coming in at 8:15, I said. "For about a month." She looked at me. "I know," she said. Of course she knew. I don't know why I thought she wouldn't. I was avoiding something, I said. I thought if I gave myself some distance, I could... I stopped. That didn't work. She didn't say anything. She held her cup and looked at me with an expression that wasn't the meeting face, and wasn't the corridor face, and wasn't any of the faces I had learned to read from a careful professional distance. It was something else. Something that had no designation in my system. "Joan," I said. "Yes, I think I need to answer your question." She waited. Still. The way she was still when she was actually listening. "I don't know how to do this," I said. "I don't have a process for it. I have processes for almost everything, and I have nothing for this. And I know the situation. I know the reasons why this is complicated and maybe impossible, and I'm not. I'm not saying I've figured any of that out." She didn't move. "But you asked me if I was joking," I said. And I wasn't. The break room was very quiet. The building was mostly empty at this hour. The air conditioning wasn't running yet, which meant for once the room wasn't cold. "I know," she said, for the third time. But this version was different. This one was slower. Lower. This one landed somewhere different from the others. She set down her coffee cup. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "that I asked someone to look into the company's policies around... You did. I wanted to know what the landscape looked like, before that night, before the dinner. I processed that. She had looked into it, before the sidewalk, before the question. And? I said. "It's not impossible," she said. "It's..." She paused, and this pause I knew was real. It would require some things. Disclosure. Changes. It's not... Another pause. "I'm the CEO, Lucy. I don't take that lightly. I know you don't. And you're someone whose work I respect, which means I'm also not going to do anything that puts you in a position where you feel..." "You're not," I said. She looked at me. "You're not," I said again. "This is coming from me. This is mine." I held her gaze. "I've been managing the distance for a month, and I'm tired of it. I'm tired of 8:15 and rearranging my bookshelf and pretending that conversation in the corridor was nothing." Something shifted in her face. Not dramatically. A fraction. The way a window shifts when someone opens it on a day when the pressure outside is different from the pressure inside. "I'm not ready to say anything is certain," she said quietly. "Not today. There are things that need to happen in the right order, and some of those things take time. I know. But..." She picked up her coffee again, looked at it, then at me. I'm not saying no." The break room was still quiet. "That's enough," I said. And I meant it. Not as consolation, not as something smaller than what I wanted. I meant it because it was true. Because this, right now, was enough. The knowing that I knew, and she knew, and neither of us was pretending. The knowing that the answer to the question she'd asked me was on the table between us now. Visible. Real. "How's your coffee?" she asked. I looked at my cup. Terrible. She almost smiled. The small, accidental version. The one she couldn't always help. "Next time," she said, "I'll bring something from upstairs." I left the break room at 7:51. I had 11 minutes before the floor started to fill up. I sat at my desk, in the ordinary light of an ordinary Monday morning, and I thought, this is still complicated. This is still not figured out. Nothing has been solved. And I feel better than I have in 4 months. That's the thing about waiting that no one warns you about. Not the waiting for something to happen. The waiting to be honest with yourself. That kind is the heaviest kind, because you're carrying it alone. And you can't put it down until you admit it's there. I put it down. On a Monday morning in a break room that smelled like nothing yet, I put it down and I felt it land. And it was heavy, and it was real, and it was also, somehow, lighter than carrying it. Nothing is certain. I know that. But I know what I said. And I know she didn't say no. And for now, for today, for this Monday, for whatever comes next in whatever order it needs to come, that's enough. If this story reached something in you, type someday in the comments. That way, I know you made it to the end with me. And if you want more stories like this one, click the video that's on your screen right now. A big hug, and see you in the next story.